Well, I don't think they were really waving flags for Ukraine. They were expressing their gratitude to donors who will reward them for voting for this terrible bill. Probably 60 to 70% of the cash will never reach Ukraine. It'll end up being circulated through the giant laundering machine here in Washington that moves funds to the Department of Defense, from the Department of Defense to military industrial production, to clients, donors, and then eventually parts of it end up back on the Hill in people's reelection funds. So you have to understand that most of this isn't going to have any impact whatsoever on the battlefield in Ukraine. Of course, the Ukrainians are running out of soldiers at this point. They're losing about 500 to 800 Ukrainian soldiers a day, and the Russian offensive hasn't really begun yet. So the place is nearing collapse. But I guess the point is to try and conceal from the American public and from the rest of the world yet again the immense failure of this policy of proxy war with Russia and Ukraine. All right, well, I can't speak for what the population or the electorate is like in Great Britain, but here in the United States, I think large numbers of Americans have been very complacent. And by complacency, I mean haven't taken much interest in foreign and defense policy. The average American thinks that if you spend $1 on defense, you get $1 of national security at the other end of the process. That, of course, is nonsense. And they don't have a real feel for how many billions of dollars are wasted on a daily basis by the Department of Defense, or for that matter, by the government. Americans are beginning to figure out that they have no representation in Washington, that the parties are irrelevant. We are supposedly governed at the behest of two parties, but in truth, we have one party. It's called the Uniparty, which is why there were only 21 Republicans who refused to support the bill. So there is no representation. Americans are beginning to figure it out, but there are still Americans who think that the coming election could change something. And you would think by now they would have figured out that it doesn't make much difference who you vote for. You get the same bad outcome. No, I don't think so. I think that there's a great deal of effort made in Washington, D.C. to create the illusion that we are still the great power of 1990 and 91. Now, there are plenty of intelligent Americans who can look around inside our country and realize that the breakdown in the rule of law, the massive invasion of foreigners that no one invited and no one wants, that's evidence for a collapse inside the country. They can see what's happening on the border. So that if you ask the average American, what's your top priority, what do you want to happen immediately, number one is close the border and restore the rule of law. Foreign and defense policy is frankly way down the list. It always has been. If you go back through the 20th century and look at polling data from, say, 1910 right up through the 1990s, Americans were almost always at least 60 to 70% opposed to the use of American military power overseas, especially interventions designed to export our culture and way of life at gunpoint. So that's never been popular. But Americans have entrusted the funding and decision-making to people they thought represented them. Now it's becoming increasingly clear, though not entirely yet, that that's not the case. Well, it goes back to the narrative. Who are the people that had spun this narrative that one day President Putin woke up in the Kremlin and decided that it was a great idea to attack Ukraine? That's a lot of nonsense. We've been working certainly for the last 10, some people would argue for the last 20 years, to provoke the Russians, to push them into doing exactly what they did. And then they said, well, this was always part of the plan. Well, if it was part of the plan, the Russian army that first entered Ukraine was quite small for the task it had been assigned. And that task was not to go very far, but to try and signal to the West, to NATO, that they were quite serious about not tolerating a threat in Ukraine directed at Russia. Well, when that didn't work and attempts to negotiate with us failed, they built this enormous force. They now have arguably the best, largest, most lethal, battle-tested, battle-hardened ground and air force in the world. And people are saying, well, he's going to attack West even further. Well, he's had opportunities now for months because the Ukrainians have always been weak to move forward, cross that river, and attack all the way to Poland. He's never done it. He doesn't want to do it. So it's a huge lie. Cameron is part of the lie. He's part of that globalist ruling class in Western Europe and the United States that has been doing everything in its power to provoke war. And if you if you don't understand why he's doing it, perhaps you should look into his finances along with former Prime Minister Tony Blair and find out who made them millionaires.
You mentioned, Colonel, the situation on the southern border of the United States. It feels as though the Biden administration has abandoned the very idea of the United States as we have known it, somehow accepting profound or fundamental change to the United States, if not indeed driving that change.
Yes. The people, again, behind the scenes who really control everything, these are the so-called donors. We refer to Washington as donor-occupied territory. It's sort of Epstein Island on stilts, where everyone is rewarded for essentially destroying their own society. And that's what's happening. There is no question about it. They want to denationalize us. And anyone who objects to denationalization is immediately attacked as a bigot, a racist, an anti-Semite, go down the list. I think we can say the following, that the people that began this proxy war and have poured so much money and resources into it were interested in ultimately dismembering Russia, removing its government, and then stripping Russia of its natural resources, which are considerable, as you know. That has failed miserably and isn't going to happen. So in the absence of this, I think there is a tremendous effort now to do something similar to Ukraine. Now, there are people who are arguing that the Donbass, this area which is historically Russian, that reaches from Kharkiv down south along the coast with the Black Sea all the way to Odessa, is resource rich. That is, it has lots of natural gas, oil, and other mineral deposits. That may be true, but that was not the real purpose of the Russian side. The Russian side simply wanted their people inside Ukraine treated equally before the law. They certainly didn't want a war. Now, in the absence of success for the proxy war to take on Russia, the same people are now looking at Ukraine. We have BlackRock and others in Western Ukraine buying up farmland. Again, some of your viewers may not be aware of it, but a gentleman named Rohrer, R-O-H-R-E-R, I think, a billionaire who lives in New York City, purchased vast tracts of farmland in Russia, Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria. And President Putin just confiscated it. And I think there are others who are operating out of New York City and London who are interested in taking over as much of Ukraine as they possibly can on the assumption that at least the rump Ukraine will survive and rump Ukraine can then be exploited for whatever assets it's got. This is a terrible situation because nothing is as it seems. Everything is, frankly, connected with this is sinister, Neil, very sinister.
Once again, Colonel, there's the British Prime Minister just really talking. We were sold protecting democracy, standing up for democracy. Now it's just about business and capitalising on investment opportunities, as you were just describing in terms of the goodness knows what riches and resources Ukraine has to offer, willingly or unwillingly.
Well, I'm not sure it's enough to make any of this viable. I think, at least in the United States, most of us regard the financial system as broken. We all expect a financial collapse. We don't know when it's going to happen, but we know it's coming. There's a very famous gentleman named Nassim Taleb, a very brilliant man who has coined the use of the term black swan. And he has said Armageddon is just over the horizon. He said that within the last couple of months. And people have said to him, well, where is Armageddon? He said, it's over the horizon. He said, well, when is it going to happen? He says, it's going to happen. He said, I can't give you the date and time. We don't know what the trigger will be. But the truth is that, it's not just the sovereign national debt, which is 35 trillion at this point, some outrageous number that we can never pay off. It's a whole range of things. We're running a government that is unsustainable, that we can't afford. I suspect that a lot of that is true in Great Britain. So the notion of going to a war footing is utterly ridiculous, particularly since there's no evidence that the Russians or the Chinese or anybody want to go to war with us. If anything, they'd like to put an end to all of it. And whether or not you like them because of their political system is another matter entirely. They're about doing business, and that's what we should be about doing. But instead, we are provoking. And this is what's most concerning. We're engaged from Armenia to Norway in finding ways to provoke the Russians in the hopes that they are going to presumably attack us, which makes no sense at all because it's nothing that they want to do. And we're not interested in escalating anything, yet that's exactly what we're doing. We are escalating day in and day out against Russia. This has got to stop because at some point, the restraint that President Putin has exercised will end. When that ends, we're staring at Armageddon, not just on the financial level, but potentially strategically.
Colonel Douglas Macgregor, I'm going to leave it on that note. It's a pessimistic note, of course, but I think it's wholly opposite. And your tone of voice, listening to you, I find so informative. Thank you so much once again for making time to illuminate us.
Sure, thanks, Neil. All the best.